Felicity Houston, and I'd like to ask the representatives of the Remain campaign a bit about the foreign policy that the EU pursues. One day, about 18 months, 2 years ago, I woke up and found that we were luring Ukraine to join the EU. And then what did that lead to but a horrendous civil war in Ukraine? The Russians have now got a foothold that they didn't have there, and there's a war going on. And the Ukrainian parliament, which may not have been the world's best, has now been replaced by, amongst other things, some neo-Nazis. So I don't feel Baroness Ashton and the European policy in the Ukraine was a very successful one. I'm now looking at what seems to be going on with the migrant policy in Turkey, and we're paying Turkey to take them back. I contrast that. Nobody ever asked me. I can't begin to imagine how I could say, excuse me, I don't think this is a very good idea. I contrast this with the vote on Libya, our involvement with that, which the Parliament decided to do, and we...
we're running out of time, so just go quickly for a question.
Very briefly, Libya, where there was a vote, where our representatives had a vote and made a decision on what our country would do, and ditto with Syria. Now, how can we go on with a European policy that just seems to set up agendas, foreign policy, excursions into places, and none of us get a say in it? That's what I find very hard to understand. And what on earth can we do about it?
John?
Well, on the Ukraine, what happened was that the Ukrainians had a change of government. They got rid of a grade A kleptocracy and replaced it with a slightly less serious kleptocracy. But part of that change was that they wanted to move closer to the European Union. They wanted to have a trade agreement with the European Union. And they asked for that trade agreement. And the European Union said that they would negotiate that trade agreement. But President Putin thought that any trade agreement between the Ukraine and the EU would be a threat to Russia, so he invaded. That's what happened. And I don't see that can be a situation that we can blame on the EU. The EU was responding to a trade situation, and in fact, in the long run, trade with Russia, trade with the Ukraine is in fact extremely important. Yeah. Ukraine could be, if it got its act together politically, the most important agricultural producer in the world. So I mean, that's not strictly a foreign policy. We're talking about a trade policy area. In security terms, our security rests with NATO. Now, but we are being told by the Americans, and not just by Donald Trump, that Europeans should be doing much more for their own defence. And that requires European cooperation. In particular, it requires cooperation between the French and ourselves, which is why we have the Anglo-French Defence Treaty, which is a very important treaty signed in 2010 by David Cameron. It is inconceivable, in my view, that we would be able to move towards more effective European military cooperation if we can no longer rely on the Americans, as seems to be the case, if we left the EU. That would massively damage our capacity to do that.
Okay, I'm going to come to Kate and then to Vernon.
Well, I think the basis of your question really is that the EU now is taking on things that it shouldn't actually have been taking on because it wasn't what people voted for in the common market. And the idea now that the European Union has, embassies in all the countries and spending fortune duplicating, so our British embassy in parts of the world has to sort of supersede almost to the, not the word supersede, has to allow the Commissioner's embassy to take priority. And this is just wrong. It's not, I don't want the European Union to be involved in any of these foreign policies. Of course we can cooperate, and every country should be able to cooperate, but the idea that they should now have almost a European Union army, which is what they really want, which will of course be totally dependent on the British army. Well, the Americans may want it, but we're not quite a satellite of America yet. We may want to have a United States of Europe, you might, but we're certainly not going to allow America to dictate everything to us as well. But when it comes to the bit, I must admit that I would sometimes rather be relying and talking to the Americans than I would to some of the people running the European Union.
Okay, Vernon, quickly.
I think implicit in what Felicity was saying, I think there were issues with respect to the way that policy developed around the Ukraine, and I think that's fair comment. We should learn that. I also think there have been other foreign policy decisions that have been made that we need to reflect on. The broader point I would make about the EU, which I don't think that we should underestimate, is the fact that the expansion of the EU into Eastern Europe has also been hugely advantageous and has been a contributor, I think, to some of the peace and security and stability, notwithstanding the issues you quite rightly raised. I think that aspect of it is sometimes overlooked. And my father, for example, who's not a massively ardent fan of the European Union, would point to the peace and stability that has been in Europe because of the experiences he had, and maybe people here would have had from the Second World War and afterwards. And I think the European Union and the ideal that came out of the Second World War and the conflict that came, I think we should never underestimate that aspect of it and building that peace and security in Europe that the European Union has been a part of delivering, notwithstanding some of the other issues.
Owen, and then I'm going to go to the lady's question.
But just very quickly, the European Union's ventures in foreign policy have been disastrous. And don't forget, the Balkans was, quote, going to be Europe's moment. Yeah. What has kept the peace in Europe, as Vernon just said, is NATO. It's the presence of a very large American garrison. I was living in Munich at the time when Saigon fell. I remember very clearly a very, very obvious physical statement by the Americans. The sky was full of helicopters, aeroplanes, and armoured vehicles on the autobahns to reassure us. And if you look at it's the garrison in Japan, in South Korea, in the Philippines, and in West Germany that has kept the peace. And that is how it should continue. We are close allies of the Americans, and NATO is the key force that's kept the peace, not the EU.
But also there is a school of thought, Owen, that says whenever countries trade a lot together, they very rarely go to war, and that's why we had initially went into the whole union as a trade thing after the Second World War, because when countries trade together, they're much less likely to go to war.
But they trade together without the EU. Could I just ask the lady for the final question? Please keep it brief and keep the answers